Hello, Indian Creek 8th grade students. This is Mrs. Stark, and I'm here to help Professor Blazek teach you all about westward expansion. And I'm going to talk about the Native American struggle specifically, and give you an introduction and brief history of the American Indians leading up to the 1850s. So, let's get started. The USA is really awesome. There's a lot of really amazing things about the United States of America, and it's definitely one of the best places on earth to live. We have the largest economy. We have the greatest military might. We have more Super Bowl wins than any other country, not to mention that we are #1 in cheese production. There are so many amazing people who have come from our country too that have made a huge difference in the world, such as Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, Neil Armstrong, and by the way, we were the first to land on the moon, and also Amelia Earhart. Don't forget that America has been a beacon for democracy and freedom since our beginning. The ideals of individualism and creating your own path have all been a part of America and were from westward expansion and the whole idea of manifest destiny too. But all of these great things came at a great cost because this wasn't an empty land ready for Europeans to just move in and claim as their own. It was already settled by thousands of Native Americans long before Columbus and long before the English colonies. These people, with rich culture, language, traditions, and governments all of their own, were practically obliterated by the white Europeans in one of the saddest sagas in history. Before Columbus, it's estimated by anthropologist Henry Dobbins that the population in the Americas as a whole was close to 100 million. Within the first 130 years post-Columbus, however, 95% of the natives had died. As you can see from this graph, in what is now the United States, the population is estimated to have been 7 million, but it's very hard to figure out exactly how many people because the disease spread so fast. So it could have been as high as 18 million. Between the years of 1500 and 1750, there was a huge decimation of the population as well. As you can see that it went down from 7 million all the way to just over 1 million. Death was a result of war, of slavery, and especially of disease. The idea that most natives were wandering nomads is actually false. It's because by the time the Europeans came to colonize, the complex civilizations had all been obliterated. In fact, Russell Thornton says, "That's the reason whites think of Indians as nomadic hunters. Everything else, all the heavily populated urbanized societies, was wiped out." Another problem that the whites created for the natives was the changes in culture brought by trade. For example, natives would trade with whites for things like kettles, knives, and guns, which then they became dependent on. Horses were brought over by Europeans as well, and that changed everything. For example, the Sioux Indians used to have to walk everywhere, and hunting would take a really long time. When they moved their village, they couldn't carry very much, and the teepees had to be really small so that their dogs were able to drag them along, because there were no horses at all in America. But then when the horses arrived, everything totally changed. The Sioux could now make much larger teepees to live in. They could move a lot more stuff with them when the village relocated. So it made it easier to travel and to hunt bison. So that made it so that food and bison skins both became much more abundant with the arrival of horses. All of these changes led to the natives beginning to have competition and wars with each other, where the smaller, less aggressive tribes would be taken over by the larger ones. One of the most famous and largest groups of nomadic Indians were the Iroquois, and they tended to beat up on the other smaller tribes. For example, the Illini, who were a peaceful agriculture-based tribe in present-day Illinois, and that, guess what, is where we got the name Illinois from, were all but wiped out by the Iroquois. And in fact, that's actually kind of a happy story, where by the time the Europeans showed up, the Illini were happy to see them because they were in such bad shape from getting beat up on by the Iroquois. Another myth is that we think of the Europeans as coming to the New World for religious freedom, and that they all came to get away from oppression. And while that is the reason why some of them came, particularly the Puritans settling in New England, most of them came to get rich. You'll see throughout this history that the relationships and policies changed as it suited the whites. For a while at first, they were friendly with the natives and depended on them for help, but the goodwill and the promises quickly ended every time the whites decided the Indians were in their way of getting more money, in all of its forms: land, gold in particular, mining resources. From the time that the United States was formed, the leaders made treaty after treaty with the Native Americans, only to break their word every time and push the natives out of their own land onto smaller and smaller pieces, away from their homes, away from everything that they knew, just to push them off again once they'd created a new home. Of course, this was all rooted in racism, because of the belief that whites were the best race, superior to the Indians and to the Mexicans, who had already settled from sea to shining sea. But their possession of the land and governments and way of life meant nothing, because it was in the way of white progress. This brings us to the 1830s, in which we meet President Andrew Jackson. He gets the Indian Removal Act passed by Congress in 1830, and that empowered Jackson to evict by force all of the Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River. That included the 5 civilized tribes, which the really sad thing about this is that they had gone through great lengths to assimilate, to act just like the white people, because they thought that that would protect them. They converted to Christianity, they started wearing Western clothes, they learned how to write and everything. So the Cherokee decided, we'll play by your rules, and they took it to the Supreme Court. And in a really amazing turn of events, because you don't think this would happen at all, considering how they'd been treated all this time, the court rules in favor of the Indians. However, Andrew Jackson basically just says, okay, great. What a wonderful ruling. Now go ahead and enforce it. And just says, yeah, whatever. He ignores the decision. So instead of getting to keep their land, the result was that the Native Americans were rounded up at gunpoint and forced to move, to give up all their lands east of the Mississippi and go to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. The Cherokee called it the Trail of Tears. The U.S. Army rounded up many of the Native Americans into forts, which were actually more like concentration camps beforehand. They kind of surprised them and told them that they all had to go to these forts so that they weren't able to take any supplies or any records or anything with them, besides really the clothes on their backs. It ended up that 4,000 of the 15,000 Cherokee died of hunger, disease, exposure, and exhaustion. Most of these, as you can imagine, were babies and children, and also the older people who were weaker and not able to survive the horrible, horrible march. And this was really devastating to the Native people because the older people were the ones who kept the histories and the knowledge of their tribe. And this is a picture of one person carrying his mother. And that is the end of part 1. And here's some questions I'd like for you to consider as you think about all this is, how does the Indian Removal Act kind of set the stage for what happens afterward if you've looked at that part in your book? And what disadvantages did the Native Americans face as they tried to hold on to their land? We've already talked about some of them, but some of them I think you could kind of come up with. And then I'm wondering if any of you could think of a better solution to how the Europeans and the Native Americans maybe would have been able to get along and not have these tragic results. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.